What would you do if you discovered your entire justice system was built on lies? One African president didn't just ask that question. He walked straight into hell to find the answer. And what he found in Cell Block 7 would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. The morning sun painted Ouagadougou in shades of gold as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of the presidential palace. Unlike other mornings filled with scheduled meetings and diplomatic protocols, this Monday carried a different energy. The young leader of Burkina Faso had made a decision that would shock his security detail and change the course of many lives forever. "Drive me to the central prison," he told his driver quietly, adjusting his simple brown shirt. "No advance notice, no press, just us." The driver's eyes widened in the rearview mirror. "Sir, shouldn't we inform the prison authorities? Prepare security arrangements?" "No," Traoré replied firmly. "I want to see how our people truly live behind those walls. Real conditions, not staged presentations." But nothing, not his security training, not his political experience, could have prepared him for what waited behind those prison walls. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the country is about to meet the most powerless. And that meeting would change both their lives forever. The black presidential vehicle moved through the bustling streets of the capital, escorted by only 2 unmarked cars. Vendors called out their wares, children played in dusty courtyards, and life continued its rhythmic dance, completely unaware that their president was about to embark on a mission that would expose the cracks in their justice system. 40 minutes later, the convoy stopped before the imposing gray walls of Ouagadougou Central Correctional Facility. Razor wire gleamed menacingly atop the concrete barriers, and the air seemed heavy with unspoken stories. The contrast was jarring. Outside, the vibrant pulse of a living city. Inside, a fortress designed to contain society's forgotten. The guards at the entrance froze when they recognized the presidential vehicle. "Mr. President," one guard stammered, fumbling with the gate keys. We weren't expecting you, sir." "That's exactly why I'm here," Traoré responded, stepping out of the car. "Open the gates." Prison warden Pascal Wedrao came running, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning coolness. "Your Excellency, if we had known, we would have prepared everything properly. The facilities, the prisoners." "I'm not here for preparations," the president interrupted, walking past him. "I'm here to meet the prisoners. Take me to them." The warden's confusion was palpable, but he dared not question further. He led the president through a narrow corridor that echoed with distant sounds. Coughing, muffled conversations, the clang of metal doors. The smell hit them immediately. Unwashed bodies, dampness, and the suffocating weight of despair. As they walked deeper into the prison, something strange happened. The usual chaos of prison life, the shouting, the arguments, the constant noise, suddenly stopped. Because word was spreading. The president himself was here. And for men who had been forgotten by the world, this was either their greatest hope or their final disappointment. As they entered the main prison block, a strange quiet fell over the facility. Hundreds of inmates who moments before had been playing cards, lying on thin mattresses, or simply staring at walls, slowly stood up. Their faces registered disbelief, confusion, and something that had been dormant for too long, hope. President Traoré moved among them with genuine curiosity and respect. He shook hands, asked questions, and listened to their stories with an attention that surprised even his own security detail. This wasn't a political photo opportunity or a carefully orchestrated visit. This was raw, unfiltered human connection. "How long have you been here?" he asked a middle-aged man whose weathered hands told stories of hard labor. 3 years, Mr. President. Theft charges. "Do you have family?" "A wife and 2 children, sir. They visit when they can afford transport." The president nodded thoughtfully and moved on, making mental notes of each conversation. Some men spoke boldly about their cases, their voices carrying the weight of untold stories. Others remained guarded, unsure whether this unprecedented attention was genuine or just another cruel tease from a system that had already betrayed them. A few simply wept at the unexpected recognition from their nation's leader. For over an hour, Traoré walked through the cramped cells, sat on concrete floors, and shared moments of human connection with men society had forgotten. Each conversation revealed layers of complexity that official reports had never captured. These weren't just statistics or case numbers. They were human beings with families, dreams, and stories that deserved to be heard. Most prisoners had rushed to see their unexpected visitor. But there was one man who remained motionless in the shadows. A man who had learned that hope was more dangerous than despair. A man who had been forgotten for so long that he had forgotten himself. His name was Emmanuel, and his story would expose the rot at the heart of an entire system. But it was in a small, darker cell at the far end of the block that the president's attention was caught by a figure who hadn't stood with the others. The man sat quietly in the corner, his head bowed, hands clasped loosely in his lap. His beard was unkempt, his clothes worn thin, and his entire posture spoke of someone who had surrendered to fate. Unlike the others who had rushed to see their unexpected visitor, this man remained motionless, as if he had given up on surprises long ago. There was something different about this prisoner. Not the hardened look of a career criminal, but the broken spirit of someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. President Traoré approached slowly and stopped in front of the cell. The man looked up gradually, his eyes meeting the president's with a mixture of weariness and profound sadness. In those eyes, Traoré saw not defiance or anger, but something that touched him deeply, the quiet dignity of someone who had endured injustice with grace. "What is your name?" the president asked gently. "Emmanuel," the man replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been here, Emmanuel?" 7 years, sir." The number hung in the air like a weight. 7 years. The president studied Emmanuel's face, noting the absence of anger or bitterness that might be expected from someone who had spent nearly a decade behind bars. Instead, he saw something that moved him. A man who had somehow maintained his humanity despite the system's best efforts to strip it away. "What were you accused of?" Traoré continued. Emmanuel swallowed hard before responding. "They said I stole money from my employer, but I didn't do it, sir. I worked for that man for many years. He needed someone to blame, and I was convenient." As Emmanuel spoke, his voice gained strength, as if talking to someone who genuinely listened was awakening something within him that had been dormant for years. "I had no lawyer, no one to speak for me. When they brought me to court, I stood alone while my former boss sat with his expensive attorneys. The judge barely looked at me before pronouncing the sentence. 15 years. The president felt a cold anger building in his chest. "Tell me about your employer." "What was his name?" "Laurent Guer. He owned a logistics company where I worked as a clerk for 8 years. I was honest, punctual, never missed a day. But then his nephew needed a job." Emmanuel's voice trailed off, the pain of betrayal still fresh after all these years. President Traoré turned to the warden who had been standing nervously behind him. "Bring me this man's file. I want every document, every piece of evidence, every record of his trial." "Sir, it might take some time to locate. You have until sunset." The president cut him off sharply. "And I want to know who the arresting officers were, who the judge was, and I want a complete record of the investigation." President Traoré had entered that prison looking for truth. But what he found was something far more dangerous to those in power. A man who had been buried alive by the system. A man whose story would unravel a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of society. Because Emmanuel wasn't just wrongly convicted, he was deliberately framed. That evening, President Traoré sat in his office at the Ministry of Justice, a thick file spread across his desk. What he read made his blood boil. Emmanuel's case was a textbook example of judicial corruption and systematic failure. The investigation had been cursory, the evidence circumstantial at best, and the trial had lasted less than 2 hours. Most damning of all was the revelation about the presiding judge, Justice Amadou Diabra, who had been dismissed from his position 3 years earlier for accepting bribes. The man who had condemned Emmanuel to 15 years in prison was himself a criminal, bought and paid for by those with enough money to purchase justice. The president picked up his phone and dialed his justice minister. "Defrain, I need you here immediately." Cancel whatever you're doing. Minister Defrain arrived within the hour, finding his president pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. Sir, you asked to see me urgently? I visited the central prison today. Traoré began without preamble. I met a man named Emmanuel who has been rotting in a cell for 7 years for a crime he almost certainly didn't commit. He handed the minister the file. Read this. All of it. Tell me how our justice system could fail so completely. As Defrain reviewed the documents, his face grew pale. The case was indeed a travesty, built on fabricated evidence, processed by a corrupt judge and defended by no one. Laurent Gueur had used his wealth and connections to frame an innocent man, and the system had eagerly obliged. Over the next 48 hours, the review team worked around the clock. They discovered that Gueur's company had filed similar accusations against 5 other employees over the past decade. In each case, the accused had been poor, had no legal representation, and had been quickly convicted. The pattern was unmistakable. A wealthy businessman systematically destroying lives to protect his interests. Even more disturbing was the discovery that several key pieces of evidence in Emmanuel's case had been fabricated. Signature analysis revealed that Emmanuel's supposed confession had been forged, and the financial records that allegedly showed his theft had been doctored with amateur-level alterations that should have been obvious to any competent investigator. We will not only free him, the president declared when the team presented their findings. We will ensure that justice is finally served, and we will make sure this never happens again to anyone in our country. The evidence was overwhelming. Emmanuel had been framed, his life destroyed by a wealthy man's greed and a corrupt system's indifference. But President Traoré wasn't just going to free one man. He was about to expose an entire network of corruption. And he was going to do it in the most public way possible. The next morning, President Traoré returned to the prison, but this time he brought media cameras and a legal team. The nation was about to witness something unprecedented, their president personally righting a terrible wrong. The media convoy arrived at Ouagadougou Central Prison as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Reporters, cameramen, and government officials followed President Traoré through the now familiar corridors, their footsteps echoing with purpose and anticipation. Word had spread throughout the prison that something extraordinary was about to happen. Guards whispered among themselves, inmates pressed against their cell bars, and the entire facility buzzed with nervous energy. Emmanuel sat in his cell, unaware of the commotion building around him. 7 years of disappointment had taught him not to hope for miracles. When he heard footsteps approaching his cell, he barely looked up, expecting another routine inspection, or perhaps a new cellmate arriving to share his concrete world. Emmanuel, came the familiar voice that had haunted his thoughts for 3 days. This time when he looked up, Emmanuel saw not just President Traoré, but cameras, legal officials, and faces filled with purpose. His heart began to race, but years of emotional protection made him hesitant to believe what his eyes were telling him. Emmanuel, the president said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence of the prison block. I have read your file. You were not only wrongly accused, you were betrayed by a system that should have protected you. The cameras captured every word, every emotion. As prisoners throughout the facility pressed against their cell bars to witness this unprecedented moment. I'm sorry, President Traoré continued, his voice heavy with genuine regret. Our nation failed you. Our courts failed you. But today we begin to make it right. He turned to the legal team beside him. Emmanuel, you are going home today. For a moment, Emmanuel couldn't process the words. Going home. After 7 years, the concept seemed as foreign as flying. His legs felt weak, and he gripped the cell bars for support. This is real, he whispered, tears beginning to stream down his face. Yes, the president replied firmly. You are a free man. As the cell door swung open for the final time, Emmanuel stepped into the corridor on unsteady legs. The other prisoners erupted in cheers, their voices echoing off the concrete walls in a thunderous celebration of justice finally served. Many of them wept openly, seeing in Emmanuel's freedom a glimmer of hope for their own situations. Emmanuel was free, but President Traoré's work was just beginning. Because if this could happen to one innocent man, how many others were suffering similar fates? The president was about to launch the most comprehensive prison reform in African history. And Emmanuel wouldn't just be its symbol, he would be its leader. 3 months after his liberation, Emmanuel stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Ouagadougou. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark jacket, he bore little resemblance to the broken man who had emerged from prison. But it wasn't just his appearance that had transformed. There was a new strength in his voice, a clarity of purpose that commanded attention. "I speak to you today not as a victim," he began, his words carrying across the silent hall, "but as a witness to what happens when power operates without accountability, and as proof of what becomes possible when leaders choose courage over convenience." In the front row, President Traoré listened with pride as Emmanuel addressed the law students. This was Emmanuel's idea, to share his story directly with those who would shape Burkina Faso's legal future. It was part of a broader transformation that had captured international attention. Operation Justice Light had exceeded everyone's expectations, revealing systematic failures throughout the justice system. In 6 months, the review teams had examined over 2,000 cases and identified 347 prisoners who had been wrongfully convicted or held beyond their sentences. Each case was a story of broken families, lost opportunities, and human dignity trampled by a system that had forgotten its fundamental purpose. But perhaps the most significant discovery had been the pattern of corruption surrounding Laurent Gueur and others like him. The investigation had uncovered a network of wealthy businessmen who had systematically used false accusations to eliminate inconvenient employees, competitors, or critics. Judges had been bought, evidence fabricated, and witnesses intimidated. Gueur himself now sat in the same prison where Emmanuel had spent 7 years, facing charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Emmanuel, who had visited his former employer to deliver a message of forgiveness that had moved even the hardened businessman to tears. "Justice is not revenge," Emmanuel had told Gueur through the prison bars. "It's the hope that others won't suffer as we both have, you in your greed, and me in my innocence." Emmanuel's transformation was remarkable, but it was the nation's transformation that truly mattered. Because one man's courage to seek truth had sparked a movement that would change the lives of thousands. But the real test wasn't just freeing the innocent, it was ensuring this never happened again. Over the following months, Emmanuel's work took him across the country, from the largest facilities in major cities to small rural jails that had operated without oversight for decades. In each location, he brought not just the authority of his government position, but the credibility of someone who had lived the reality of wrongful imprisonment. In the northern town of Dori, he discovered a man who had been forgotten in a cell for 12 years without trial. In Bobo Dioulasso, he found 3 women who had been imprisoned for economic crimes that investigation revealed to be simple poverty. Each case strengthened his resolve and deepened his understanding of how justice could be corrupted by indifference. But Emmanuel's most important contribution was his insistence that reform must go beyond simply freeing the wrongfully convicted. He advocated for comprehensive support systems, job training, psychological counseling, family reunification services, and legal aid programs that would prevent such failures in the future. "Freedom is not just opening a cell door," he explained to a gathering of international human rights observers. "It's ensuring that people have the tools to build meaningful lives, and that the system that failed them is rebuilt to serve justice rather than power." Under President Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso became a model for judicial reform across West Africa. The country established legal aid clinics in every region, implemented mandatory training for judges and prosecutors, and created an independent prison oversight board with Emmanuel as its chair. The changes were not without political cost. Some powerful figures who had benefited from the old system pushed back, accusing the president of being naive and Emmanuel of being vindictive. But public support remained strong, especially as more families were reunited and more injustices corrected. 1 year after his liberation, Emmanuel returned to the Ouagadougou Central Prison for a ceremony that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The facility had been completely renovated, with improved living conditions, educational programs, and legal aid services. Most importantly, A new plaque hung at the entrance. Justice delayed is justice denied. Never again. As Emmanuel stood in front of his former cell, now filled with law books and hope, he carried with him not bitterness for the years lost, but gratitude for the lives that would be saved. Because sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't wealth or position. It's one person's willingness to listen to a voice that others have ignored. Standing before the assembled crowd of officials, former prisoners, and their families, Emmanuel reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A year ago, I sat in a cell believing that the world had forgotten me, he said. I was wrong. The world hadn't forgotten. It simply wasn't listening. Today we celebrate not just my freedom, but our collective commitment to ensuring that every voice is heard, every case is fairly judged, and every person is treated with the dignity they deserve. President Traoré took the podium after Emmanuel, but his words were brief. Sometimes, he said, a leader's greatest achievement is learning when to follow. Emmanuel has taught our nation more about justice than any law book ever could. The work continues, but the foundation is strong. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Emmanuel remained for a moment in front of his former cell, now converted into a library. Through the barred window, afternoon sunlight streamed across books on law, human rights, and social justice, tools for future generations to build a more just society. Walking away from the prison for the final time as a free man, Emmanuel carried with him not bitterness for the years lost, but hope for the lives that would be saved by the changes they had fought to implement. Justice, he had learned, was not a destination but a journey, one that required constant vigilance, courage, and the willingness to listen to voices that others might ignore. The sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, as Burkina Faso continued its own journey toward a more just tomorrow. President Traoré had entered that prison looking for truth. Emmanuel found freedom after 7 years of injustice. But the real victory? A nation that chose to listen to its most forgotten voices and had the courage to change. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who remembers what it feels like to be powerless. And that memory, that connection to human suffering, is what transforms leaders from rulers into servants of justice.